Good morning, everyone. It is really, really exciting to be here and to be back. As Nancy said, I'm Joanna Williams, and I sort of was raised as a faculty member here at UVA. My first faculty position was in the School of Education and Human Development. I was here for 12 years and just sort of slipped out under the cover of COVID a couple of years ago to join the faculty at Rutgers in the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. And I am back in my home state of New Jersey, which is a good place for me to be. And I'm really excited to be back, particularly for this space. So I continue to be an affiliate of Youth-Nex, and I think this meeting that brings together so many different perspectives on panels like these is a really critical one. I want to give another shout out to our opening panel that I think set the tone for what it means to think about bringing youth voice into spaces like these. I don't think I quite have the same moderation skills that Ziona Bryant has, but I will do my best to create space for our panelists to talk about their perspectives, specifically on what it means to think about youth voice and agency in the context of systems like juvenile justice or child welfare. The description of the panel in the guide, I think, suggests the idea that when we think of youth-serving systems like juvenile justice or child welfare, for me at least, the first thing that comes to mind is not youth voice and youth agency. Often, frankly, it's the opposite in thinking about compliance and silencing young people. So I think our panelists today have some really interesting and unique perspectives on what we might dream as being possible for thinking about bringing youth voice to these spaces. So without further ado, we're going to go down the line and start with introductions. So,
good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Andy Block, and I live here in Charlottesville and teach at the law school. I guess I'm here today because prior to coming back to law school, I was the director of the State Department of Juvenile Justice in Virginia for 5 years. And prior to that, had a career as a children's rights lawyer and child advocate. So I was the guy who threatened to sue the Department of Juvenile Justice, and then they brought me in to run it. And who knows whether that was a good decision or not. But I'm really happy to be here. And Zana, you made my week or month by remembering our meeting when you came down to Richmond. So thank you for bringing that up.
Good morning. My name is Sage Williams, and I served as the president of the Student Government Association at Bonaire Juvenile Correctional Center. And really happy to be here today and participate in this conversation.
Good morning. I'm Renee Spencer. I'm a professor in social work at Boston University, and I do research on youth mentoring. That's my primary field of interest, and really got excited about youth mentoring, partly from my training as a clinical social worker. I worked for a number of years as a clinical social worker and then went back to school to become a researcher, and just got really interested in how, what kinds of relationships and how good, strong relationships with adults can promote good development for young people. And that's how I landed in mentoring. And so I've done a lot of work, mostly qualitative. So interviewing many mentors, youth, in some cases where appropriate, the youth's parent or guardian, program staff, about mentoring relationships in an effort to really try to understand what makes them go well and how do we get them right and what gets in the way and makes them fall apart, and kind of when we get them right, the difference that they can really make in young people's lives, but also how they can really enrich all of our lives. Did some work on one particular kind of mentoring program called Youth-Initiated Mentoring Program, which I will hopefully be able to talk with you about a little bit this morning.
Good morning, everybody. I am Chidi Jenkins. Once upon a time, I traipsed around these grounds as Chidi Uche. I was a student here and also went to the School of Ed, then Curry School, so really glad to be back on grounds. I am coming to you all by way of some work that I'm doing with Youth-Nex, actually, that we'll be talking about later on today. But I also work for Ascend at the Aspen Institute, which is a policy program that really focuses on child and family well-being and ensuring the health, well-being, and prosperity of all children and families in this country. I also served in my last role in Governor Northam's office as advisor on childhood trauma and resiliency, and was helping lead our policy efforts around responding to the needs of children and youth in the Commonwealth, the systems that they are involved with, the families and communities that are there to support them, and what all of the moving parts in those areas across sectors. So with all of our child and family serving agencies, the work that they needed to do in order to respond appropriately, especially during the pandemic. So glad to be here today.
All right, so we've got a lot of great expertise in the room, and like with the last panel, keep in mind some questions that you might have for our panelists. We'll reserve time for that towards the end. So I want to start with a question, and Sage, I'm going to turn to you in a moment. When we think about youth agency and youth voice through policy in the context of systems, I'm wondering about specific examples of policy changes that you feel have had meaningful impact. So you were incarcerated at Bon Air Juvenile Correctional Center. So I wonder if you might start by sharing a little bit about that experience, and then tell us about maybe a policy change implemented while you were there that you felt had a meaningful impact on you.
Thank you for that question. So, when you think about a juvenile prison, if you have this really kind of harsh image in your head of a lot of concrete and steel and a fair amount of violence and, just a really kind of cold, dark place, that's 100% accurate. And when I first got to Bon Air in 2015, it was very much that place. And, I really want to talk about today the power of relationships. And when I first got to Bon Air, there were no relationships between staff and residents. It was all it was a directive. They open your door and, hey, cuff up, you're getting searched. Or, hey, you're going to the dining hall for breakfast. That kind of stuff. There was no small talk. There was no rapport really possible between residents and staff. And then in about 2016, the agency, DJJ, implemented a new program called the Community Treatment Model. And this completely changed everything. And it wasn't some, really sophisticated education opportunity or anything like that, or college courses, I would say, that, made this profound impact. It was something really simple. One of the key centerpieces of the program allowed for staff and residents to build rapport. So now when they open your door, it's, hey man, how are you? How's it going today? You think Tom Brady is going to win the Super Bowl again? Do you think, I saw you on the phone earlier. How'd that phone call go? And it seems like a small thing, but this really changed the dynamic. And I speak for myself here, but I'll tell you, a lot of the guys I know and did time with at Bon Air and who are now out and doing really well, it was the same. They're saying the same thing, that they had the opportunity to build rapport with these staff. And some of us are closer to those staff than we are our own families. And that's why we don't want to let those people down. And I believe that is why we haven't had issues with recidivism. The group that I was with who experienced this community treatment model, we haven't had, as high recidivism rates as, previous generations of kids who've gone through Bon Air. And again, that's all because of the power of relationships. So, if there's anyone here who's going to be involved in public policy, or who's going to be the head of some division in the foster care system, or maybe a director of the Department of Juvenile Justice someday, just remember that when you open up the door for staff and young people to care about each other, it can really help kids stay focused on doing the right thing.
Thank you, Sage. Excuse me. Andy, I understand that it was under your leadership that this policy was implemented. So tell us more.
Funny how that works out. We're sitting next to each other. So I will give you a little bit of a before and after, if I can take a couple minutes to explain it. So that 3 weeks before I started working at the Department of Juvenile Justice, there was a suicide in Beaumont Juvenile Correctional Center. And so my first day or second day on the job, I was sitting watching this grainy film footage from the camera in the cell block where the kid lived of a kid and staff like pulling this lifeless body of a young man out of his cell. And so one of the so people were gathered around the conference room. This was literally, it was my second day on the job, and the attorney general's folks were there, and they were starting to tell me like who was liable and who we should fire and how basically we should cover our asses and stay out of trouble. And I said, hold on a second, tell me about this kid, and kid came from a busted up family, had been a victim of sexual violence, was a perpetrator, which is not that uncommon. Dad was totally out of the picture. Mom was an addict, was in the care of his grandmother. And because we had so little programming in the facility, and the staffing was terrible, you may remember these days, like kids were in their cell all the time. And he had hit the age of 18 and gotten his GED, and it turned out we had no educational programming for kids. Even though we could hold them till they were 21, we had nothing for kids to do after they got their GED or diploma. And so part of it was me saying, oh my God, this is 10 times more screwed up than I thought it was going to be. Why did I take this job? But also realizing we have to change, and it's not just a matter of positive youth development. It's like a matter of life and death for these kids. And so in lots of ways, that story and thinking about all the systems that contributed to that young man feeling so hopeless that he took his own life, that was the genesis of all the changes that we made during the 5 years that I was the director of the department and the years following my departure. Briefly, the community treatment model was, and so one of the policies that was in place was staff were told they could not engage with kids. They could tell them to shut up, get in line, but they were mostly there to keep bad things from happening. They weren't there to make good things happen. And so one general point I would make about all this stuff is, especially for child-serving systems, we need to change our paradigm from risk reduction to skill development and future enhancement and youth empowerment. And there's more risk involved in trying to make good things happen for kids when you run these systems, because more things can go wrong. But that's what we need to be doing. And so this idea of staff not being able to engage with kids was very much about the fear of staff and kids developing inappropriate relationships. And so because we were afraid of that, we just said, you can't do it at all. So we had to change the whole way that we engaged with kids and did work, and staff and kids were moved around from unit to unit. So part of the foundation was we said kids and staff are going to stay together, to create community. Each pod in the juvenile correctional center would be almost like a self-standing treatment community where kids could develop relationships with each other, and the youth and staff could develop relationships with each other. They were trained to be, the staff, the line staff who spent most of the time with the young people, had no treatment skills prior. And so we were training them in how to run groups and how to be engaged and all that kind of thing. And I could go on and on about it. I'll tell you one story just for systems people. In order to do this, it required changing everybody's job description and shortening their work days and teaching them new skills. And in state government, you can't just blink and make that happen. So we literally had to lay everybody off, which made me very popular, and have them reapply for these new positions. And so, and you can't send all the kids home and train all the staff at one time, right? Because they're locked up. So we had to do this one unit at a time. And so this is not for the faint of heart. People were up in arms, they were mad, people didn't want to be soft on kids, all those kinds of things. So there was the transition period was incredibly stressful. I think you were in one of the first units, right, that converted, but all of a sudden there was payoff. And I'll stop talking, but some of the behind the scenes of it. And the outcomes were, I'll just say this, the outcomes were amazing, right? Like kids had more freedom. We were doing this other stuff to get a lot of kids out. So the kids we had in the facility were higher risk profiles, quantitatively, but the levels of violence went down, all these other things. So I'll stop.
Thank you for giving us insight into, the context as well as all of the work that went into systems change. I'm wondering, Renee, if you could sort of jump in, because for SAGE, this, in thinking about high impact, really relationships were at the center of this. So if you could just share with us your perspective on why you think relationships, are so critical, and also maybe how you see them in relation to youth agency.
Sure. And I just want to start by saying just how impressive that changeover really was. I mean, it's just incredible to hear you describe going all in and really putting relationships at the center. It's phenomenal. And then to have Sage be here speaking about the impact, the direct impact that had on him and many other people he knows who were kind of living under what I would call, to me, relationships are like oxygen. We cannot function or live without them. They cut to the very core of human existence. And so when I hear that environment described, it's like an environment without oxygen for our hearts and souls and minds and kind of who we are, our basic essence as human beings. It's an environment completely deprived of oxygen needed to survive. So when you described it as a life and death situation, it truly was, right? Unfortunately, with the tragedy of the loss of the life that triggered this for you, but for all of the lives that we're living under those circumstances, it's truly a life and death situation. And it's so interesting to me how hard this is for us to hold on to kind of as a society and a culture of how important relationships really are to our very kind of human existence. And it was so inspiring to hear the young people, the panel that we kicked the day off with, the many ways that they were talking about the things that empowered them and helped them to be the amazing young people that they are in this world are rooted in really strong relationships that they had with people who were authentic with them, people who listened to them, people who encouraged them, people who noticed when they were holding back and thought they had something to say and drew that out. All of these are signs of being in real relationship with young people and with one another. Yet we really have constructed societies that interfere with our ability to do that. We have these sort of institutional structures that make it really hard to do that. And we, in many ways, actually not only devalue, but at times denigrate relationships. And thinking about one of the trigger words that you used there was, people were afraid you'd be soft on the kids, right? And that's that sense of somehow being soft to engage and say, hey, how are you? When you open up that door and encounter another human being, why not start with that? What makes that being too soft? That's being human, engaging kind of human to human. And, it's interesting in the pandemic, I feel like too, we sort of learned it for a second and I feel like it's already passing, we're forgetting already how painful that kind of social isolation was for all of us to be holed up in our own individual spaces, hopefully with other family members, but maybe not. And maybe not with people that was great to be confined with in that space for very long, because your real sustaining connections were other places. But we all sort of went through this and had this collective experience of losing our social connections and the significant price that we paid for that. And interestingly, we have to kind of relearn this. So when I first went to graduate school, we heard a lot about risk and resilience and still do, but what was noticeable to me was the resilience side of it. And one of the key factors for resilience for young people, for all of us, are safe, supportive, nurturing relationships. So young people who have that can weather all kinds of adversity. And we've got lots of good research to show that. And that sort of fades and we focus again on risk. And then more recently, we've been talking about there was a whole movement towards adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and sort of looking at the ways in which all the terrible things that can happen to us and both at the individual level and structural level, and how that can add up and really have consequences for us. And that's really true. And what buffers that? Surprise, surprise, again, we're learning strong relationships are one of the best buffers for those kinds of adverse childhood experiences, and they're calling them positive childhood experiences. And it's just important, it's super important to have those positive childhood experiences. So we really have to focus on nurturing and building those strong relationships. That's the best thing we can do to mitigate risk, is focus on building these nurturing, engaging relationships. More recently, we've been talking about social isolation. That's sort of the new buzzword. And in fact, in Great Britain, I think there was a minister of loneliness for a while. I don't know if they're still there, but there's such a recognition of the health costs when we are isolated. It's on par with smoking, the health risk for an adult who's socially isolated. It's that devastating to our health. So if we think about that's true for adults, and what about a growing, developing young person? Again, it's like oxygen. We have to have these nurturing, sustaining relationships. And an old theory that I really like is this theory called self-determination theory. And it sounds like kind of, old separation, individuation. And I really think of that as old ways of thinking about human development. What human development is all about in and through relationships with others. That's who we become, who we are, is in and through these kind of growth-promoting, nurturing, sustaining relationships. But there's this old theory called self-determination theory. And what I love about it is it talks about kind of 3 things that we all need to be motivated and kind of engaged in the world. And one of them is relatedness. That's kind of the foundational, the bedrock. And then it's autonomy, so voice, right? Having the voice that we heard about on the panel. And then the third piece is competence, that sense of efficacy or agency. But you can't build agency and competence outside of relationship. It just doesn't work. You have to have those people who are in your court, tapping your shoulder, looking you in the eye, saying they care about you, know that you exist. Let's start there. That just kind of, again, the example that Sage gave of opening up the door and human to human. You've got to have that kind of contact. And in the foundation of that kind of contact and connection and real human interaction, then you can build that sense of agency, competence, and it really can grow from there. But it's so interesting. We really put relationships kind of off to the side, like they're an extra or a bonus or an add-on, and they really are the very heart of who we are.
Thank you so much, Renee. I want to bring this back to thinking about, in the context of systems, change often happens through changing policy and practice. We've heard one example of what this could look like. So the question I want to throw out there is thinking about how policy can support bringing youth voice to the table and have young people be part of the conversation, maybe with some other examples that our panelists have seen. And Chidi, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah. So I think the first thing I'll say is that when we're translating the really nice conversation with amazing young people and then kind of downloading what that means for them as individuals and maybe a community of young people, a collective of young people, the role that plays on behalf of the adults in the room is the investment in actually doing these things. Connectedness and relationships, I don't think anyone can deny what it does for each one of us as humans. This costs money in 2022, okay? It takes each of us talking about it and then doing something about it, either in our relationships with young people or in the people that we vote for or the places that we put our money and or our taxes, in being able to invest in the systems that actually support those changes in our behavior and the supports for young people. So I just want to remember that it's rainbows and stars when we talk about the awesome counselor that saved me when I was 13, who was 23 and wasn't quite an adult, but also wasn't a kid and just changed and turned around my life. But that costs money to put that person in my life a lot of the time. And it costs a lot more, and not always the dollar amount if it's a person of color or a woman. So what was your question again?
Just thinking about how do we work through policy to bring young people to the table and center their voices.
So I will just highlight one way that in state government we had an entity, which I think in retrospect, I know did not go far enough. And I say that in transparency and in an effort to try and do better as we move forward. But in Virginia, for 2 administrations, we did have a children's cabinet. And not every state throughout the country has one, and they take on different forms. Sometimes there are local children's cabinets, sometimes there's children and family cabinets, sometimes they're called councils. But ours here in Virginia during the McAuliffe administration really took on the posture of a very narrow set of platforms, if you will, around school, nutrition, access to food, nutritious food, school meals, etc. It was a platform of the First Lady at the time. The second Children's Cabinet, which was for the Northam administration, broadened its scope of policy work to be inclusive of maternal and infant health, student and campus safety, trauma-informed care, again, access to food, so food and nutrition, and there was one more that is leaving me at the moment. And we, in many of those cases, brought onto each of our working groups youth voice, especially when it came to the student and the campus safety efforts. There were several school shootings around the country at the time, and it was a response to not only the infrastructure needs of our campuses and our schools, but also the mental health supports that were clearly evident pre-pandemic, and what we were going to do at the state level to respond to those needs. And I will just say that the few students that we had sitting on the work group always spoke up in just the right moment when a bunch of adults were fighting or disagreeing around how we were going to better lock doors and maybe put cameras up. And they were like, psych, I need a counselor to talk to. And I'm 13 and I'm sitting here talking to grown people. Please give me relationships, give my friends relationships. We desperately need this. And they were able to do it in such a meaningful way that none of us felt like it's just another young person trying to say something and insert themselves. It always made a huge difference to have them at the table. And I always recognize how intimidating that must have been to kind of carry that weight as a young person in a room with legislators and appointees and state leaders that were really having very high level conversations, but we needed it desperately. And I say today that we needed more of it. And so one thing I will say is a lot of states also have youth advisory councils to the governors and or to legislators. And I think that's something that we need here in Virginia. And I would love to see it stood up. So I think we can play a role in that too.
Just a couple other general points about policymaking to improve youth voice or create relationships. We did this little exercise one time at the Department of Juvenile Justice, and we realized that there were 13 degrees of separation between me as the director of the agency and the staff who worked with SAGE. And so when you think about policy, you have to think about how do you change the whole culture to impact that one-on-one relationship in the right way. It's true in education, it's true in behavioral health. We're talking about how do you change the classroom experience of teachers and students, but how does it get from the governor down to the classroom? How does it get from the agency head down, to the unit that SAGE is on? And it doesn't matter the content. If you don't think about the execution and the supervision and the culture that you need to do all that, it never is going to work. You can't just tell people to do something. That doesn't work at all. And so supporting the people in the right way. Another thing that is incredibly important to remember is that to do change work and to create new paradigms and new cultures, you have to figure out how you sustain it. And, in Virginia, for example, we have single-term governors. And we were lucky with the Northam administration. Governor Northam hired one of my deputies to replace me so we could keep doing the work that we had started, because you can't get it done overnight. And so thinking about how you sustain these paradigm changes is just as important as thinking about what change should you make.
Thank you. Sage, I know your title in the program is former president of the Student Government Association at Bonaire. Again, when I think about juvenile correctional facilities, student government is not something that comes to mind as even existing. So I wonder if you could share a little bit more about, the student government and your role there, and whether you experienced it as a place where you felt like you had some agency.
Absolutely, and I can't thank Mr. Block enough for the humility they all had for actually listening to us. And funny story about Governor McAuliffe. he actually invited us, a couple kids from Juvie, to the Capitol building, and we met with his cabinet, and they gave us advice on how to run a self-governing organization. So that was pretty cool. Definitely an interesting experience. Yeah, I mean, just, having a seat at the table where we could participate in the dialogue with the facility administrators. I mean, the buy-in that created was unlike anything I had seen in a juvenile correctional environment. And yeah, it was just a really amazing experience.
Why don't you tell a little bit about how it worked, so people understand the structure of it, and then talk about.
So the goal was to have every unit in the facility would have what we called a mayor who would kind of keep the peace on their pod, and above them we had a series of governors, and we divided up the facility into districts, and these governors would report to the vice president and the president, and essentially any issue that happened in the facility, everything from asking for more chicken nuggets to having some extra deodorant to, hey, we need to squash this thing over here because guys are getting hurt. Anything really, we would just all talk about and be like, how can we find a compromise? How can we, solve this issue? And I think it taught a lot of us a great deal about leadership. I definitely learned when I first, was the president of the SGA. I was not great on leadership. I definitely told people what to do rather than ask them what to do. And just that small thing, learning, okay, it's better to ask people what to do than to tell them what to do, has benefited me greatly since then after I've learned that. Yeah, that's the SGA overview.
Can I fill in a few details? So Governor McAuliffe was very interested in the work that we were doing. And that's like another kind of takeaway for policy, is having leaders who are open to doing new things is really important, and creating a culture where people can have crazy ideas. And so he heard about this, and he invited the kids who were talking about the state government to come and present, like Sage said. And then his chief counsel was in the meeting, and he said, well, if you want a government that lasts, you need to create a constitution. And so the kids, and not all the kids in the system had high degrees of education or educational success, but they said yes. And so the governor's lawyer worked with them on creating a constitution. I'm sure there's no other constitutionally based government in a juvenile correctional center in the country. But they wrote the constitution, they held elections, they did all these things, and we took their feedback and sought their feedback regularly on lots of important issues. And oftentimes there were problems that you all could solve way better than the grown-ups could solve. So I can't and Sage was a multi-term president. I think you were the third president, but I'm not sure how that worked, but he kept getting reelected. I think because he was doing a great job. And it made our lives easier having kids like Sage in the facility.
So this, in some ways, this speaks to opportunity as being important in the context of systems, youth having opportunity, and also fostering skills. And Andy, I know you had some ideas and you sort of referenced this in these examples, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about, the importance of thinking about skill and opportunity as it relates to developing youth voice and how we can embed this into youth serving systems.
Sure. What obviously was clear from the first panel and is clear to all of you is that kids are incredibly talented if you give them the space to be talented. And my thought and our collective thought at DJJ over time was like, let's not put a ceiling on where any kid is, and let them do as much and grow as much as they were able to do. So we didn't have college classes. We brought in college classes. College classes aren't for everybody. So we had a way more robust, vocational training and career and technical training. brought in forklift simulators and other kind of welding classes and things like that. And the idea was like, if they wanted to be great, we should not get in the way of them being great. And, a small example is we had a young person in the facility who was a great artist and very talented. And so staff figured out a way to, they sought permission, they just didn't do it, but to like take him to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and let him see what that was like, and have those experiences. We had a quilting program in the facility, which is not, you wouldn't think kids in the juvenile justice system and quilting would go together. And these kids were unbelievable. And we just kept putting more and more resources into that because they were making beautiful, amazing things. And actually, Governor McAuliffe, they wanted to give him a gift of a quilt, so that governor invited them to the executive mansion to present their holiday gift of this quilt they made. And he hung it in the lobby of the Patrick Henry building, which is where all the governor's office, executive offices are in the state, for the entire duration of his governorship. And there was a sign explaining what it was. So like the kids who made it got to come and see their stuff hanging up there. So I think just as a general principle, we should like let kids be excellent in whatever system, and like consider it our obligation to create opportunities, and never like put a roof or a ceiling on how much growth they can experience. So I could bore you with specific details, but I think that's how we should orient our systems.
Hear, hear. Renee, I wonder if you could talk about this idea of skill and opportunity and youth agency and voice in the context of relationships and what it sort of means from your perspective.
Yeah, I was just thinking as Andy was talking, and also as Chidi was saying earlier about the money, relationships cost money. And that there was this mentor campaign. So I work in the field of youth mentoring, and every January is National Mentoring Month. And there's usually a lovely ad campaign that they do to sort of try to encourage people to volunteer as mentors. And one of the ones that drove me nuts was one year that they said it doesn't take special skills to be a mentor. And that one really got to me, because I think it does in fact take special skills. Now, they're not special in the sense that they're skills that any of us as human beings can engage in, but we don't all do it, and we don't all do it well. And some of us have had it sort of trained out of us, and some of us haven't had good modeling ourselves, so we don't know how to do that for somebody else. And so not everybody's sort of cut out for this. So it's also part of what I was thinking about, Andy, when you were talking about going through the redefinition of the jobs and rehiring. That gave you all the chance to get the people with the right skill set into those jobs. And also Andy talking about not putting limits on young people's talents and potential and opportunity. And not all adults are good at that, unfortunately. Like, we need to, as a society, work hard to get better at that. But I think in the meantime, we need to get the right adults in place who have that capacity to create space, to really listen to young people, to create the space to allow for that kind of opportunity to grow and emerge. And that's going to cost money, right? To get the right people. But we have to value that and really see this as a high level, highly valued, big payoff set of skills that we then invest in, instead of, again, as I was saying earlier, the kind of bonus, extra, nice to have, kind of lovely maybe, as long as you don't go too far and you still pay attention to the hard outcome thing. We really have to shift our perspective on this, I think, to create these kinds of contexts that Andy was describing and that Chidi is encouraging us to really promote and go after.
Just to the money thing, this is kind of specific to our work in the Department of Juvenile Justice, but it's an example of this. So we not only wanted relationships between staff and kids, but we wanted to try to rebuild or maintain relationships between parents and kids, right? And so we only ended up with like one juvenile correctional center because we closed the other ones, which was great. But so kids were coming from all over Virginia to the facility, and the level of parent visitation and all that was incredibly low. And so we decided that we would pay for transportation. We would pay to bring parents to the facilities, and we had buses and shuttle vans and things like that from all over the state, and parents literally got to see their kids for the first time. And we tried to create a more welcoming space for families so they wanted to come and see their kids. And so there's multiple levels of relationships that we should value. Like the foster care system needs to value the relationship between kids in the system and their birth families. It shouldn't try to replace that unless that's the last resort. Schools need to value the participation of parents in their kids' education, and it's not just about the teacher and the kid, it's about parents and their kids in the school. And juvenile justice systems need to think about the professional child relationship, but also building, maintaining, strengthening, all those things, of the family relationship too. So because that's the one that lasts, right? I know you have great relationships with the staff who are on your unit, but you got your mom and dad for life, and hopefully you can find a way for them to be there for you as well.
So I'm going to throw out one more question, and then we'll turn it over to all of you to ask some questions. When we think about, the contexts and experiences and settings and histories that bring young people into contact with systems like juvenile justice or child welfare, it's important to consider issues related to trauma and resilience as well. So, Chidi, I want to turn this question over to you. What's the role of trauma and resilience in relation to thinking about youth voice and agency within social systems like these?
So I'm really glad that you brought up just in general, the concept of resilience, which I think if you're sitting in this room, you get it, right? We don't need to unpack the fact that we all face adversity, some of us more than others, some of us different adversity than others. But when you're given the tools to kind of react, bounce back, as some say, is my favorite saying, but not have it be the end all be all, is something that we all need to work. And that's a prevention effort, right? Investing or valuing the preventative policy or systems and programs that allow young people to be resilient. I think when we talk about youth voice, what we're also talking about is giving young people the opportunity to share their perspectives and their experiences. And so when we think about that in the context of trauma and what you have experienced, that question of what has happened to you, not what is wrong with you, we are able then to level set and pivot as the adults in their lives, and also allow our programming and our systems that support them and their families to respond to what it is that they need. Not what it is that we think they need, and not what we think they need in the long term, but what they need right now. And so an example I used to use in trainings a lot was, you may screen a young person for trauma, you might unpack and find out 3 or 4 ACEs, and there's one of them that stands out to you as wow, they definitely need some significant psych support, but in fact, they are really worried about their hungry siblings at home. And that either wasn't a question that you asked, but that is the more urgent need that they have in the moment. They are not worried about something that happened 2 years ago or something that is happening in the periphery of community violence, for example. And so how we respond to not only what they share with us about what has happened, but asking them, well, what is it that you need right now? What is it that your family needs right now? Because to help child and not mom, dad, caregiver, grandparent also works against progress. And we know that when we think through a 2-gen lens and just generally how we think about supporting young people in the context of their family home, whatever that family looks like. One thing that, not everyone is on the same page about is whether or not to screen for trauma. And I'm not here to debate that, but more so to also ask the questions when you are asking in a trauma-informed manner about what the like protective factors in that individual's life are, so that the systems that we refer them further into are actually addressing their needs and are building upon their strengths, and not perhaps what is arising as challenges that are in their life. At the state level, juvenile justice has adopted a new screening tool. They're no longer using the ACEs. It was Virginia created. It's called the Screening for Experiences and Strengths, and it also asks questions about resilience factors and is strengths-based. And they also have a training which all probation officers, intake officers, and CSU unit folks are trained on and currently doing in the juvenile justice system. So when we talk about consistency, it was your predecessor. No, the person who came after you that ensured, literally she signed that document on like the last day of the administration to ensure that that moved forward and that we were taking a strengths-based approach to young people who were incarcerated. We've also done a lot of conversation about juvenile justice, and I just want to make one point about the child welfare system, which needs just so much attention broadly, but I'm going to get really specific on a soapbox about also the welfare of Indigenous children in this country, but also specifically in the Commonwealth, and their needs, which are very specific and unique to Native people and the trauma that they have experienced for hundreds of years in this country. Without the history lesson, I just think it is imperative that we pay very close attention to their unique needs and ensuring that we protect their sovereignty, their land, and the rights of their parents to keep their children on tribal land, and ensure that they are able to instill the culture and the spirit and the traditions of their people when it comes to the needs of their children. It's not only a prevention measure, but it's something that we promised them hundreds of years ago, and that is currently on the chopping block with the Indian Child Welfare Act that will be going before the Supreme Court shortly. And so when we think about Black and Brown children, we also need to be sure we're talking about Indigenous children, because it is our duty and a moral imperative.
Thank you. Now I want to turn it over to the room to ask your questions. So there's folks coming around with a microphone.
Hi, everyone. Enid Ray. Thank you to the panelists. This question, I'd like to start with Sage and Andy and then move to the other panelists if possible. But it seems that often we require or give the work to young people to navigate systems. And I'm wondering what the warm handoffs can look like. Andy talked a little bit about the work within the system, but then what happens when young people leave? And what do we do in terms of helping those transitions? Because often my experience has been, right, that systems are encapsulated onto themselves, and how we kind of create that roadmap for young people to move forward is something that I'm very interested in and working on actively.
So when I was first released, there was a agency that coordinated with young people getting out to find jobs, and that was a huge help. Just really allowed me to hit the ground running. I'm ashamed to admit I do not remember the name of the agency, which is a real injustice. But I think that was by far the most helpful thing. I mean, literally, like my second day, free and clear, I had a job. And I think without that, it would have been a much more stressful period in my life. And that's the big thing. Everything else, there wasn't really any other supports in place that I noticed, but they really came through on the employment piece with the reentry programs.
I think the point you make is a great one. And, Chidi's point about the children's cabinet, one of the things that neither children's cabinet tackled, but it's a really big issue is the one you're talking about, right? Like if one agency does everything that it needs to do for a kid, and then it becomes some other agency's responsibility, like the local school system, for example, we don't always have the laws and structure in place to make sure that there is a smooth handoff and that kind of thing. So what we spent a lot of time doing at the Department of Juvenile Justice was kind of front loading that work and trying to problem solve and puzzle through it. And I know the job stands out for you the most. I think there were other professionals like who maybe are less memorable, who are involved in your life. But when it works well, which is not every time, hopefully the young person leaves the foster care system or the juvenile justice system or graduates from high school or whatever it is with a plan in place and the people identified who are going to do what. And a key part of that also is figuring out who is like their primary caregiver or guardian or custodian and helping them have the supports and tools. And Sage was fairly independent when you got out. So it was a different situation with him, but that's incredibly important. And I think, we again, on our good days, which was not every day, like started thinking about what's the plan when a kid gets out, really as the kid was coming in and start sort of building towards that and thinking about that. And you're preparing for that, again, best practice the whole time. And so but it doesn't work that well all the time. And it only takes one agency not to do their bit and the whole thing can come tumbling down.
May I just ask a follow-up question for either of you? In thinking about centering sort of youth voice and agency, I'm wondering how that was part of this, planning. Like, Sage, did you feel like you had some say in these are the priorities that I have upon release?
Yes. And no one took them seriously because they were too ambitious, they said. Yeah.
Oh, come on.
The truth.
But yeah, so we would, again, best practice, have young people at the meeting where they're coming up with their own plan and that sort of thing. Sage's, was probably to be a millionaire by the age 25. You might be close, I don't know. But that's the idea, is to have them involved in the decision making and choice making and planning.
Thank you all for your thoughts. My name is Josefina Bañales. I was hoping you all could speak to some of the tensions with engaging with youth voice and agency work in the context of systems that weren't created, for the thriving of youth of color and low-income youth of color, right? There's a tension here. And I particularly want to reflect back to the youth panel with our youth leaders, right? So many of them were talking about radical imagination, right? Maybe even doing away with the system, right? We didn't make this system. And so I'm hoping if you all can just talk about some of the tensions there around, youth really pushing back towards a system that they didn't create, right? And how do we actually take those visions for liberation seriously?
I think you said it very well. The systems were not made for radical liberation. Certainly not the juvenile justice system. I think there's a lot of, I don't know if it's at the core, but there's a lot of concern about the well-being of children, their safety when you're engaging them in conversation when they're under the age of 18, right? So there's very baseline concerns about which children speak, when they speak, what it's used for, are we protecting them? So I think that just for lawyers in the room, they're oh, be careful when you bring a young person into the room to voice their. But from a policy standpoint, and when we're thinking about just these very high level conversations that actually are not high level at all, that I think the current generation of youth is very comfortable having. You're dealing with a generation of people who are not comfortable with that, and also do not know how to translate that into like legislation. And also have not figured out how to translate that into investment that the data can back up. And until you have enough data, which to them can take years, and then it's not the right data, and then it has to be able to fit into a system, but then that system doesn't talk to the system in the other agencies. Social services maybe doesn't talk to a Department of Medicaid, which doesn't talk to juvenile justice, which certainly doesn't talk to Department of Education, then it's already scrambled. And those are just some of the challenges. So that doesn't address your concern necessarily.
On the just like interpersonal level of that, I was thinking about the example of the young person in the previous panel who talked about voicing to the debate coach ideas, to which the response was, "You're not 18, you can't vote, you don't get to have a say." I think that highlights how it's rife with tension, right? If we're going to sit as adults in the positions that we occupy and open up forum and really engage young people and really listen to what young people have to say, we're going to get challenged. Like, that's the bottom line. We will be challenged, and challenged profoundly at times to our very core, to things we hold dear, value greatly. So it's really difficult, I think, to navigate. And I think that's part of why you've got to get the right adults in the right places who can be open and be willing to imagine. And I think, the way Andy and Sage were talking about the youth governance in the juvenile justice system here is a much more, like, young people seem to have a real say in profound ways. Does that mean have young people had a say about everything they had something to say about? But there were real ways that the young people impacted that system by their voice and by being engaged. And there were adults around who were willing to engage with them. And I think that that's really what it requires. But boy, it is hard, because we will be we will. If you really listen, then you're going to get challenged. And you have to be willing to be open to that and hold steady in the face of that. And am I willing to reimagine? Can we actually reimagine together?
I'll just ask you, Sage, like, did you have times when you were frustrated or felt limited by me or the head of Von Air or whatever, like in something you guys wanted to do at SGA? And how did that resolve itself? Did we listen or not? And feel free to say either.
You guys had the humility to listen, and we always appreciated that. I just think that, we really wanted to take the wheel. And I think that you guys let us do that 70% of the time. But the other 30% of the time, if you let us take the wheel, I think we could have even went further. But 70%, that's pretty good. I'll take that.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot about like it's on the adults, but it's also on finding the right adults who do it. And there has to be a tolerance. Maybe that's the wrong word, an openness to risk, and an openness to new ideas, and an openness to listen. And these systems are screwed up in lots of different ways, but it doesn't mean like we can't do better work within them. And yeah, we shouldn't have the systems, it's yet another, sad thing we're passing on to all of you, is we've created a bunch of screwed up things in our society that don't work that well. But I don't want you to get the idea that you can't make progress and you can't make things better. And it's incredibly inspiring, to hear Sage or hear all the young people who are up here before. And it even is true, like in pre-professional schools and law school also. I work with students on doing actual policymaking work, and I have this idea, like I want them to be excellent in the same way I wanted kids in the system to be excellent. And sometimes that means them telling me when I have it wrong, and letting them have their own ideas and be creative and things like that. And so I think creating structures for that to happen is important, but also being open to the idea that maybe the structures we have aren't the right structures. But I am an eternal optimist, and I really believe that there's lots of good work to do still. Like, there's a reason to be pessimistic, but there's just as much reason to be hopeful.
So I kind of have a two-part question. One is specifically around practices, right? So we can have the structures in place. We can create a leadership team. You can create a youth advisory board. But at the end of the day, if the young people aren't being heard, it's kind of like, well, what's the point? And so what are the practices you're putting in place to ensure that young people's voices are actually being heard, right? And on the other hand, you guys said, like, sometimes you do have to like rehire people and stuff. But when you do have people that you have there, you may not be able to do that, or even the people that you hired, they still need capacity building, right? So what are also the capacity building efforts that you're having to ensure that your staff have both the shift of like the minds and hearts of like they value this and they want to do this, but also they know how to do this? Because a lot of times nowadays, this is a big rah-rah thing. We all believe in youth voice, but is it happening in practice? And people don't have those skills sometimes.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we did at the Department of Juvenile Justice was we created a set of, this is a partial answer to your question, a set of guiding principles for both staff and youth that applied to everyone. And part of it was being responsive to the trauma that young people experience, but part of it was also being responsive to the trauma that staff experience, from being victims of violence themselves and stuff like that. And so our guiding principles were that, number one, everyone needed to feel safe. Staff and youth needed to feel safe. Number two, everyone needed to feel connected. They needed positive relationships. They needed to feel that they had purpose, like they were getting the skills and training they needed to advance in their lives. And last but not least, they needed to feel like they were being treated fairly. And so your question about supporting staff, right? It would be unfair to say, you go have a relationship with SAGE if we didn't give them the support and training and skills necessary to have a positive relationship and think about that. So I think you're exactly right. You need to support the adults doing the work that young people need them to do. And can't just tell people to do it. You need to give them the skills. And in terms of structures and thinking about it, you're absolutely right. Like, you need to make sure that happens. We created this culture where everybody wanted to hear from the young people. I don't know what it's like. There's a new director now and there's a new vision. So a lot of those structures, sadly, depend on who's the leader. And they're hard to maintain and ensure. But you're totally right. We can't just say it. We have to make sure it happens. Hopefully that answers your question a little bit, but I'm not sure. I don't know if other people have thoughts.
I can also give an example of an approach. It's not a like overarching, here's how staff training and support is just so critical for adults that are in these roles, for sure. But the program type of program I was talking about in the introduction, this program called Youth-Initiated Mentoring. It's an approach to youth mentoring where what traditionally has happened is that youth mentoring programs go out and recruit a pool of volunteers, and then young people come and say they're looking for a mentor, and the agency does the work of kind of matchmaking, like I'm going to pick this adult and match it with that young person, and kind of hope that a good relationship, develops. And that works some of the time, but it doesn't work as much of the time as we'd like to see that work. So people are sort of futzing around for other kinds of approaches, and a program kind of out of necessity came up with this idea of why not have young people identify somebody in their existing social network that could serve in this role, and then the program can recruit them, train them, support. They bring them in and formalize that mentoring relationship, but it's the young person who identifies the mentor. It's not the agency just recruiting a pool of volunteers and matching. And we did a very small study about this and went out and interviewed mentors and young people, and again, where appropriate, because these were systems involved youth, if the young person's parent or caregiver was involved, we interviewed them as well, and we interviewed program staff, and it was stunning to me, the difference. I was also doing a study of relationships that were matched in the more traditional way at the same time, and what we observed was that young people picked out those adults who listen, who have respect for them, who young people would say, they know my backstory and they don't judge me. They care. They care what I have to say. And so it was really eye-opening for me to sort of see, putting the young people in the driver's seat. They know who those adults are in their environment who are good at this, and they did a mighty fine job of picking them out. What was interesting to me as well is, to a person, when we interviewed the mentors, they said they'd never thought about volunteering to be a mentor, or if they had, they were way too busy. There was no way that they were going to, invest in that. So the young people were also tapping a pool of mentors that mentoring programs were not able to access and never would access. These aren't people who were going to sign up to be in a mentoring program. They agreed to be a mentor because that young person tapped their shoulder. And another difference that I heard that was really profound is I'd done a lot of work on mentoring relationships that don't succeed. It makes me really popular in my field to go after this question, but it's a really important question. And I heard from many mentors kind of having their expectations about what the relationship would be like, this sort of like fantasy version. And then they were confronted with the reality of like hanging out with a young person and a teenager can like cut your self-esteem to nothing in a heartbeat. I mean, they're experts at it, right? So mentors were like being cut to the quick and giving up. And what these mentors said, and they would say, I hope I can make a difference in the life of a young person. The mentors that were selected by the young people said, wow, I just learned I already made a difference in the life of this young person. So it wasn't like I now had to go out and prove something. Like, I already matter to this person. That's pretty powerful. Yes, I'll sign up. I'll do this. I know I already matter. And they had some sense of what it was going to be like because they already knew the kid. So it wasn't some idealized version of what mentoring was going to be like or what the kid was going to be like. It was, I already know. And we can hang it. We could spend some time with this. So it was a really profound lesson. I think just an example of putting young people in the driver's seat can just open up all these possibilities.
Thank you, Renee, for sharing that example. We are getting near the close of our panel, and I want to give our panelists the opportunity just to share a core takeaway for them when thinking about youth agency and youth voice in the context of youth serving systems. And I also, just like with the first panel, will encourage everyone to find the panelists during lunch. We'll move into lunch after this to continue these conversations. So Chidi, why don't you start with our closing?
I'll be really short. I would encourage all young people who have the chops now or want to get the chops to find what you believe in the most and then run for office.
Awesome. A core takeaway for me is we need to put our money where our mouth is and invest in relationships.
Yeah, just remember the power of relationships and what she said about getting involved in public office.
What they said. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your engagement. Thanks, our panelists, again.